I'd like to start off with my interest in the Santa Fe Trail. When I first began my work as a graduate student in ancient times at the University of Colorado, I started my dissertation with trying to figure out why the Southern Cheyennes and Arapahoes, when they had their first reservation in Colorado, had an irrigation system built for them. And that led to the introduction to my dissertation. And then as I worked on it, it became the first chapter. And then as I worked on it a little further, it became two chapters. So I realized at that point that I had a different dissertation going than the one I had originally planned. And so I kept those two, but when I published my first book on irrigation in the Arkansas River Valley in Colorado and Kansas, I lopped off those two chapters and decided to write another book. And that one has been in the hopper now um, for about 30 years. And now that I'm retired, I think maybe I can actually finish the thing. But it really revolved around a lot of what was happening before that reservation and the development of that irrigation system for the Cheyennes and Arapahoes. I refer to it as the first reclamation project ever attempted by the federal government, and it had to do with the fallout from what had happened over the previous, I would say about 40 to 50 years with the Santa Fe Trail. And that led to what happened with eventually with the Cheyennes and Arapahoes. And so I became fascinated with what the Santa Fe Trail actually accomplished. And we think about the trail opening in 1821. And in a technical sense, that's correct. But in a different sense, that trail had been heavily used for quite probably centuries before it became formally known as the Santa Fe Trail. And this is because Indian peoples, even before the Comanches arrived in the Great Plains and before the Cheyennes and Arapahoes and Kiowas did, many other precursors used that route to follow animal herds, particularly bison. So it was a well-known route cutting east and west through the grasslands. And when the Spanish came to the Great Plains and the central grasslands of Kansas, eventually that same path, when Zebulon Pike traveled it in 1802 and 1803, he referred to that same route as the Spanish Road. Now, when we think about a road, we don't think about a trail. Trails in our imagination are narrow routes cutting through a particular area, whereas a road indicates something much more substantial. And the Spanish had been plying this route for nearly 150 years prior to when even Zebulon Pike started using it. And the French traders coming into the area as well prior to that had been using it to trade with Indian peoples. And so how did this become known as the Santa Fe Trail? Well, this probably had to do with the fact that, first of all, Spain, which this whole area was called New Spain at the time, even up into parts of Kansas. The Spanish controlled this area and nearly all of Colorado well into the early 1800s. It wasn't until around 1818, 1819, that the residents in what today is Mexico decided that they had enough of the Spanish crown, and through a series of revolutions, eventually created their own republic beginning in 1821. Now that's what opened up the trade route formally for Americans to go into what we would call today New Mexico. And but what we need to remember is that prior to this, when Spain controlled it, they didn't want anything to do with Americans. And in fact, Americans were trying their best to get into New Spain, and that's what Mexico was called at the time, and to access trade with not Santa Fe, even though Santa Fe had been established as early as 1620. That wasn't the destination that Americans wanted to go to. They wanted to head down into the northern part of what today is Mexico, to the mining cities of Durango, Chihuahua, Zacatecas. Those were fabulously wealthy cities. Lots of silver was being mined out of there. It was certainly funding the Spanish efforts to try to maintain their colonial presence. And this is where Americans wanted to go. Now, what Spain and other European countries understood, that if American traders were able to ply an overland route down into that area, there was the possibility then that those cities would be brought into the economic political orbit of an emerging American nation. And that was something that England, Spain, France did not want to see. They didn't want to see that happen at all. But once the people of New Spain overthrew the crown and created the Republic of Mexico, then they opened up those trade doors to Americans. That was the first time. Any Americans before 1820 who were caught anywhere in New Spain were rapidly rounded up and put into prisons for a while in Mexico City. That's where Zebulon Pike spent a little bit of time when he was exploring. So this then opened up the trade routes. And the importance of the Santa Fe Trail then from this point on is the way in which the connections were re-altered in North America. Now the United States was able to extend its economic reach westward, where it had been cut off from that before. This opened up not only possibilities of trade down into Mexico, but it also opened up the possibilities of maybe even linking as far away as California. So this opportunity opened up in a big kind of way that had been cut off before. Now, what this also did, though, was encourage a different kind of relationship with the Indian peoples who lived in the area. So this is what fascinates me, is the whole trade connections that began emerging out of this, and the ecological consequences that occurred as a result of opening up this trade through the grasslands. Now, when we start thinking about the grasslands at this time too, it's important, I think, to get a different kind of mental image about what they look like. First of all, there were a lot of riparian woodlands, isolated woodlands throughout the grasslands. There was an area called Big Timbers along the Arkansas River, basically stretching, if Zebulon Pike is correct, from just about almost the border, the present day border of Kansas and Colorado, all the way to the Purgatory River. There was a timbered area there. There was a couple timbered areas, one up on the upper reaches of the Smoky Hill River. And a lot of these timbered areas were wintering grounds for Indian peoples on their migratory hunts for bison, particularly the Pawnee and the Osages. Now, this is before the Cheyennes and the Arapahoes were to come down into the area of the Great Plains in Colorado. The Comanches were to the south of the, if we can envision sort of a map in our own head, the Comanches were in an area to the south of the Arkansas River. Now, they were extremely powerful and they were expansionistic. And the Spaniards and the New Mexicans referred to that area as the Comancheria, in other words, the land of the Comanches. And nobody made a mistake about thinking about who owned what. Now, the Spanish government, before it was kicked out of the area, could think, well, this is part of New Spain. Later, the Mexican government could say, well, this is part of New Mexico, it's Nueve New Mexico, and or Nueve Mexico. But the people who lived around Santa Fe knew better, and they knew that that land was controlled by the Comanches, and the Comanches didn't care who called it theirs, they knew who occupied it. And so they were a very powerful force who had acquired their horses after 1700. And they came into this area after 1700 and began hunting bison. And there's a huge story about what made the Comanches flourish as a result of this. And this is another side story that I don't think I want to develop right now. But think about the Comanches just controlling that area along with their allies, the Kiowas. To the east of them was also a very expansionistic group of an Indian nation called the Osages. Now, the Osages were very powerful as well, and they had connections to St. Louis traders. And the St. Louis traders gave the Osages something that made them a very powerful people. It traded with them guns. Now, nobody in their right mind and around New Mexico traded guns to the Comanches because they knew arming them would make their lives even more difficult than they already were, and trying to have a rapprochement with the Comanches and their expansionistic tendencies. But this put the Comanches at sort of a disadvantage, obviously, with the Osages who had guns through their trade connections with the French. To the north of the Osages, of course, they're somewhat kindred because they spoke very similar languages, would be the Kansa people or the Kaws. And then to the north of the Kansas were the Pawnees. And the Pawnees also were very powerful and expansionistic, and also similar to the Osages, had access to guns because they traded with the French as well. And so that kind of sets up, hopefully, in your mind, sort of a mental image about where these different very powerful groups of Indian peoples resided, and the kind of competition over the natural resources in the area that might have put each of them into. Well, when you open the Santa Fe Trail trade in 1820, this also opens up an opportunity for others who are having troubles to the north. These are the Cheyennes and the Arapahoes. The Sioux to the far north in the grasslands are just as powerful and expansionistic in their realm as the Comanches and Kiowas are to the south, and as the Osages and the Pawnees are to the east. So the Cheyennes and the Arapahoes, not having the power that the Sioux have, move southward. And by 1820, they're in the region of present-day eastern Colorado. Now, this puts them into a very powerful position as sort of traders in an economic system linking the nations to the south and the nations to the north. And they have been in contact with some traders coming out of St. Louis, a family called the Bents, and encouraged Charles and William to set up, rather than trading with the fur companies that went up the Missouri River far to the north, they said, why don't you come south and set up a trading post? And then we can all work together. And so this is what the Bents did by the early 1830s. Charles and William set up a post on the Arkansas River near La Junta, Colorado today. In fact, you can see, I don't know how many of you have seen it, but the National Park Service has done a recreation of Bent's Fort. And so the Bents set up this trading post in the early 1830s, and with another fellow from St. Louis by the name of Surain St. Vrain, and they created the Bent and Vrain Trading Company. So they were operating out of St. Louis, and this is because now they could draw trade goods out of St. Louis and then put them together in Bent's Fort and start then doing two kinds of trade in a very powerful sort of middleman position. They could trade to the south into Mexico, and then tap the mining cities to the south through Santa Fe. They would go through Santa Fe and then what was called the Royal Road, the Camino Royal. They could go south along that road down into the mining country. That's where all American traders wanted to head who were using the Santa Fe Trail. They wanted to get down into that mining, those mining cities, because Santa Fe itself was sort of a dumpy little outpost of a city at that time, and really didn't have much in the way of trade opportunities. It was to the south where those opportunities really lay. And so the Bents had well positioned themselves. They had positioned themselves to trade south to the Comanches. They had positioned themselves to trade north. And that put the Cheyennes and Arapahoes into that middleman position where they could take trade goods from Bent's Fort and take those trade goods and trade north with the Sioux. It also opened up hunting opportunities for the Cheyennes and Arapahoes. And in fact, this put them into conflict with the Comanches and the Kiowas to the south. And eventually, to resolve that conflict, they worked out a peace arrangement in 1840. Just to the east of Bent's Fort, the Cheyennes Arapahoes gathered on the north side of the Arkansas River, and on the south side gathered the Comanches and the Kiowas. Now, both these groups had resources that the other one needed. The Comanches and Kiowas were desirous of having guns so they could defend themselves against particularly the Osages. And the Cheyennes and Arapahoes wanted access to the huge, massive horse herds that the Kiowas and the Comanches had. Some of the individual men among the Kiowas and the Comanches, they had herds that were numbered as individuals, herds that numbered anywhere from 100 to 300 animals. Huge herds, and that constituted what was considered the wealth of an individual. So in 1840, they started trading and setting up a peace arrangement between the two. Now, what this did, it also opened up the area south of the Arkansas River to bison hunting for the Cheyennes and Kiowas. Now, this had very important ecological consequences for the bison herds. What this meant was that the Cheyennes and Arapahoes could freely go down there and start hunting, which they did. And they brought the hides back to Bent's Fort because that was the medium of exchange, or the bison hides and furs. So the Cheyennes and Arapahoes only had two things really they could trade, either furs or horses. That's all the Bents could get from them. But the Cheyennes and Arapahoes wanted trade goods from the Bents. And what we don't realize is just how important those trade goods were. And I've been able to make a list of the kind of things that that the Cheyennes wanted from Bent's Fort. They wanted saddles, they wanted kettles, they wanted frying pans, tin cups, they wanted water kegs, they wanted portable ovens, they wanted coffee mills, they wanted coffee pots, they wanted bridles, they wanted spades, they wanted pitchforks, they wanted scythes, they wanted files, they wanted spoons. All these were manufactured goods that they had, no ability to do on their own, but yet they could trade for them if they had the right amount of furs. Now, the one trade item that they really wanted, which is really devastating for these people, was alcohol. Now, alcohol was outlawed. The United States had outlawed the trade of alcohol into Indian Territory, but this didn't stop the flow of alcohol into that area. And the reason for this, if I had all of you here to give me a show of hands, I'd be interested to see it. But how many of you would engage in an illegal trade activity if it met a 600% return on investment? Okay, Jill would. That's the kind of returns that oftentimes could happen in the trade alcohol business at that time. And so the Bents were going to do this regardless of whether or not the federal government said you can't. And I've been able to access some of the Bent's trade ledgers, and sure enough, that's where the trade alcohol shows up. They also, at their posts, had a lot of alcohol for themselves. And what's interesting to me is how their post was sort of the Walmart of its time. And international trade goods. When you look at the kind of things that they had for the Mexican trade, they were trading French cloth, ribbons, shirts, pants, cotton pants, flannel shirts. They were trading New York and French blankets, and also English rifles, New York guns. They were bringing in coffee from Sumatra, from Colombia. They were bringing in dried fruits. They were bringing in sugar from Havana. it was amazing to me the kind of international emporium out there in the middle of nowhere that this was. And for Indians, for the Indian side of the trade, they had beads. Most of these were European manufactured beads because the Cheyennes and Arapahoes didn't care for American beads, apparently. Tobacco was very popular, but also trade alcohol. In one time that in the wagons, in one shipment, they took over 1,230 gallons of trade alcohol and several barrels. And so they were into this business quite a bit, and the alcohol flowed quite freely, but not to good effect, that's for sure. So all these trade connections were there. But like I said, for the bison, this was a horrible situation because of the fur trade that was associated with it, with acquiring the furs. And so oftentimes we think about the bison herds really not being decimated until the 1870s with the white buffalo hunters that went out with their long rifles. But Indian peoples have pretty much pushed the bison herds in the research that I've seen and the research I've done myself, pushed it beyond its reproduction levels by the 1850s. And it's very interesting to me that Yellow Wolf, a prominent Southern Cheyenne, was talking with an Indian agent by the name of Fitzgerald, Fitzgerald, and talking to him in 1852. And the agent wrote back to the superintendency in St. Louis and said, strange as it may seem, but the Cheyennes and Arapahoes are in, and then the next words are all capitalized in his letter to emphasize what was happening. He said, in a starving state. And he noted that there were no antelope, no deer, no bison anywhere near Bent's Fort in that area because they have been hunted out. And so the trade opening that the Santa Fe Trail created was really devastating for the animal populations in that area. The trade alcohol was also devastating to Indian peoples. And so in two ways, the reproduction levels for what was once had been a very healthy grassland ecosystem with a wide variety of animals had by 1860 virtually collapsed. Indian peoples were not able to reproduce their own population. Animal herds were not able to reproduce their own populations. And as a result of disease, particularly smallpox, but also the spread of STDs among Indian peoples, which was also devastating for their reproduction levels, you have a dying off of the old folks like myself who would carry the institutional knowledge of their people. And so it was harder for the cultures to actually reproduce themselves. So when we think about this, we need to think about this in a large context of reproduction failure. Now, I know I've gone on for 30 minutes. I know I have introduced a lot of elements into this that may seem like maybe they're not tied together. So maybe we could engage in some question answers, and I can further elaborate on maybe some places where some of the guests have some questions about, hey, what in the hell is going on here?
I'm going to go ahead and ask my question, Retta, if that's okay.
Okay, sure.
So it became very clear to me that the Santa Fe Trail was an economic trade trail.
Oh,
Very,
yes.
very different from say the Oregon Trail. I mean, this was not families moving to a new life. Um, this was pure economics. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Uh,
Exactly. And huge numbers of animals, wagons, moving back and forth. And what we have to remember about the movement of that trade, Jill, is that the it only occurred at certain times of year, because when we think also about the ecological aspects of the trade at this time, you had to have fuel to power the draft animals. And that fuel is only going to become abundant at certain times of the year. And so you have this huge amount of traffic crossing in the spring and in early summer, and starting to play out in the fall as the grasses go dormant. And and so uh, it really made it hard for uh, that whole swath of land to recover um, year after year of being used and overgrazed that way. And so uh, it's interesting when you think about the trail. There are some aerial photographs that have been taken of the Santa Fe Trail. And in places, the wagon ruts that you can still see from aerial photography today were nearly a half-mile wide. And so that's just the wagons coming up. So anytime that you camped at night, um, if you were in the wake of, let's say, a caravan that had preceded you, well, that campground was already overgrazed. So that meant you had to go someplace else, or you had to go farther out each time in order to refuel your animals and continue on. So the limitation, and so the whole thing was also limited by water resources.
sure.
You cannot run those animals beyond water sources. And this is what um, we think about the grasslands being just this magnificent open area, but actually it was fairly limited in terms of where Indian peoples could go, because they also had these huge horse herds. And the difference between horses and bison is that horses can't go without water for over a day if they're being used for anything. Bison, on the other hand, can go, as all of you know, several days without water and then come back to it. So you can imagine how this sets up the hunting arrangements too, and camping arrangements. And so, and then how do you overwinter? Because, the Cheyennes and Arapahoes are still out there overwintering when nobody else is traveling the trails. And so these riparian woodlands that I was talking about, um, the caravans in the spring are going through and using those areas and chopping down the wood and making their campfires and everything. So those areas become now shrunk. And then Indian peoples come and use them because there's only certain places where you can really go and overwinter safely. It's in those same riparian areas. So by the time of 1860, what Pike had seen as a huge timbered area along the Arkansas River bottoms had now shrunk to a very small area near Bent's Fort. And so these woodlands, these riparian woodlands disappeared um, during this same time period. And so you're right. I mean, all this is an economic movement, but it's having huge ecological effects throughout that ripples all the way out through the grasslands.
That might still be rippling. Well, obviously it's still rippling with the bison.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. I know I deviated a little bit from your question, but does that help?
Yeah, no, it was fascinating. I've got tons of questions and I'm not going to hog them all. I'm going to send it back over to Retta because I think there's some more.
Yeah, we have a question. Was the decimation of the great herds mainly the result of firepower of traded guns, the adoption of horses by more tribes, or competition from hunting parties of different tribes in the traditional hunting grounds?
All three. all three led to that. I mean, the Comanches before 1700 were basically living hand to mouth in the mountains, in the Rocky Mountains. They had to keep their population sizes down in terms of their in terms of resource availability. And during that time, the Comanches were prone to practice infanticide to keep their populations down. So they had enough resources to supply each other. And so once they acquired horses from the Utes, because the Utes acquired horses from the Pueblos who had kicked the Spaniards out of New Mexico during the Pueblo Revolt. From 1680 to 1700, the Pueblos basically controlled all of New Mexico. And then the Spanish came back in, and the Spaniards refer to this as the Reconquest. But during that 20-year period, all at once, horse trading flourished everywhere. The Spanish not only didn't want to trade guns to the Comanches, they didn't want to trade horses to anybody else either, because horses, guns gave the Spaniards a tremendous advantage over Indian peoples who didn't have those resources. And so, but once the Comanches got a hold of horses, and they understood also how to reproduce horse herds is something else that we oftentimes don't think about, but they were working to reproduce their horse herds as well. They became really great at this. And so they come out onto the grasslands, and because of the previous way in which disease had decimated the previous population out in the grasslands, the bison herds were able to really flourish because the hunting pressure had been taken off of them. And so when the Comanches come out there, horse-born, they have these immense bison herds that now nobody's hungry. And so they're in order to increase the ability to protect their hunting ranges, they want to increase their population now. And so what you find in the 1700s are Comanche raiding parties going down into northern Mexico and raiding haciendas, killing the men, taking the boys and the girls and the women, and integrating them into their nation. Now, why would they do that? Well, the young boys are going to be great at tending horses and becoming warriors themselves. And the girls and the women are going to be great at helping them reproduce the population and increasing the number of people that they have. So the Comanches go from infanticide to now raiding to increase their population. It's an amazing story, and all because now they have access to horses and bison herds that they never had before.
We have more of a comment. If you can get a copy of The Prairie Traveler by Randolph B. Marcy, about 1859, for instructions on how to travel the trail.
Yeah, Marcy's book is a fabulous entry into this. Yeah, he really details what it was like to travel across the grasslands at this time.
So we probably wouldn't have had an Oregon Trail if we hadn't had a Santa Fe Trail.
No, Jill, I think the Oregon Trail would have come around one way or another, because it was altogether sort of a different kind of thing. And I mean, first of all, it was missionaries, and they were following the fur company's routes up the Missouri River, and then going across to present day Oregon and Washington. And so I think we would have had that regardless. And now how that would have played out had Mexico prevailed during the United States war with Mexico, well, we might be looking at a very different kind of configuration of the United States today. But that area probably would have come into the United States. The other thing is, it also depends upon how well England would have supported the Hudson Bay Company in terms of its domination of the trade to the north of there as well. So they were in competition with those rascally Canadians.
So the Spaniards coming over, and I guess Coronado and what was it, Cibola, and bringing the horses completely changed everything.
Yes, remember yes, the horses changed. Yes, absolutely everything. And yes, there's absolutely no question about that. And remember, the Comanches really didn't acquire horses until after about 1700. And the Cheyennes and Arapahoes didn't have horses until, probably sometime in the mid to late 1700s. So what we think of as sort of a prototypical Indian culture, this horse-born riding people, it was really a very new phenomenon for them. And what is clearly evident to me and a couple others who have really looked closely at this, it is very possible to think that the Cheyennes and Arapahoes and others really didn't have time to work out those ecological arrangements with horse herding, bison hunting, adapting to the grasslands, because it was such a short time frame. And then they had all the other pressures coming into it that were all together new as well. For example, all the trading that's flowing out of St. Louis through American traders or the earlier French traders. And so I can't imagine how difficult it was to make all those rapid transformations. But I will give you one story that I think is fascinating in this regard. Earlier, before the Cheyennes ever made their way out to the grasslands, they lived up along the upper reaches of the Mississippi River. And there was this one fellow, he's a Mennonite missionary with the Cheyennes. His name is Rodolphe Petter. And he actually worked at Bethel College. And he did the first Cheyenne English dictionary ever. And this he did in 1914. And he was interviewing I saw a little bit of this in his handwritten marginal notes in one of his volumes. And he was interviewing this 90-year-old woman, a Cheyenne woman, and she was remembering her grandmother's stories. All right, so this pushes it back quite a ways. And her grandmother remembered the time that the Cheyennes lived on the upper reaches of the Mississippi River in the valleys. She said, at one time, her grandmother said, at one time we lived in this land of plenty. We had rice, we had birds to eat, fowl, we had fish, corn, nobody went hungry. It was a wonderful time. And then we moved out, then we had to move out to this place in the grasslands where all we had to eat. And the next portion of this was so striking to me, where all we had to eat was this stinking bison meat. So for women, that transformation from living in this area where it was agricultural and a rich hunting land and the harvesting of wild rice and berries to going out to the grasslands and now bison. It also shifted the Cheyennes from a matrilineal culture to a patrilineal culture. A huge transformation in terms of internal power structures within the nation. And all that had to do with making those adjustments to new ecosystems.
Why would it be patrilinear to go to the grasslands? Why?
Because of the importance now of hunting bison.
Rather than gardening?
Yes. And the trade that resulted of this, and the importance of horses. And for women out in the grasslands, it was no picnic, absolutely no picnic. They were the ones who had to do the cooking. They were the ones who put together the lodges. So it took about anywhere from 10 to 15, depending on how large your lodge was. Treated furs in order to, or skins to create a lodge covering. They also were the ones who tended the horses. It was the women and young children who tended the horse herds. So that put you on the outside of the village. And if there was a horse raid, who do you think was in harm's way? So it was a very dangerous situation for them as well. There was a missionary with the Pawnees. The Pawnees finally got horses as well and put them into a very powerful situation. But the women also were the ones who had to go out from the earth lodges and then take care of the horses in the winter. And the missionary wrote back, interestingly enough, that it created a lot of arguments within the families and led to oftentimes divorce cases. Because the women, I guess, weren't too crazy about going out there and taking care of the horses in the winter, while their husbands sat around the fire and told war stories.
I don't blame them.
Yeah. So the historians have looked at what this meant for women. It was not a pretty scene for women.
Yeah, even though horses equated to power and probably wealth, somewhat, with the Native American tribe, it wasn't an easy life. But I would think the Lakota would have been maybe a little more suited to that.
Well, no more suited than everybody else. I mean, they had to make the transformations also from hunting, gathering, or in some cases for the Dakota, making that transformation from agriculture to a hunting-based culture. So all of them made really big changes. And for some, it worked out well for a time being, and for others it didn't.
Right, if you didn't master the horses and the horse hunting, I mean, if you're not a good rider,
Yeah.
you're not going to do well.
Well, and for the, let's take it again for the Pawnees or the Mandans farther to the north. They lived in these very large earth lodge villages like the Kaws did. You don't move those villages around very often. Maybe every 6 to 10 years you move them. But if you have horses, then around those earth lodges, around those villages, then you have to go farther and farther and farther out to do grazing, because nobody's raising hay or alfalfa or anything else. So it's just all relying on the reproductive capability of the grasslands itself. And it also made it easier for those nations like the Cheyennes or Arapahoes or the Sioux, who had portable lodges to move around easily. So they were harder to find, but the Pawnees were easy to find. The Kaws were easy to find. The Osages were easy to find because their villages were more permanent, and in one sense of way thinking about it. And so they were more easily raided than the Kiowas or Comanches or Cheyennes or Arapahoes villages.
I have more questions. I'm looking to see if anyone else has any, but I have tons of questions. So, okay, so the Comanches had the largest herds and were the most powerful.
They were
Indian
the most
nation.
powerful in terms of the possession of animals.
And they were, and where were they located?
If you think about central Texas, and then west to the Rio Grande, okay, and then from basically northern Mexico up to the Arkansas River. That would be the Comanche area.
So I've spent a lot of time in West Texas, and I can tell you the grass is crappy. So even though they had much less desirable grazing there, they still managed to survive with huge herds of horses.
Yeah, the grasses may be crappy now, but also the grasslands were going through a remarkable sort of environmental change at the time. One that was related to the ending of what climatologists call the Little Ice Age. And the Little Ice Age produced a cooler climate throughout the grasslands and a little more rain. And when we think about people like Long and others calling the grasslands a desert, when I look at like Long's journals in eastern Colorado, when he was going through there, I think it was around 1812, they're talking about, and this is in the summer, they encountered several days of rain. The grasses, he never complained about the grazing conditions. And so this was no Sahara desert that these guys were going through. And so what did they mean by desert? And this became a little clearer to me when I read this diary by Gibson. He was writing about traveling with the army out of Missouri during the war with Mexico in the 1840s. And he was in Westport, where the army was forming in Kansas City and Westport. And he was talking about civilization. And then he was talking about how on the other side of the line, because this was Indian territory, wasn't Kansas yet, he was talking about how that was a desert. But then he described the grasslands, and he talks about the richness of the grass, the full blooming of the prairie plants, and how beautiful it was, but he referred to it as a desert. Now, what he was talking about is that on one side of the line was, quote, civilization in Missouri. Whether or not we still consider Missouri civilized or not, or I don't know. But he was classifying it as civilized. On the other side of the line was Indian territory, which was not civilized. Even though he talked about already the immigrant tribes that were there, the houses that they were living in, their herds and their farming, and how prosperous a lot of them looked. But that was a desert. So desert probably had other connotations other than just simply landscape. It had a cultural connotation attached to it as well.
Sounds like it.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions, folks? It is 12:57. And we're about to the end of our discussion. I could personally talk with Jim all day. Any other questions, thoughts, comments? He does have 6 books out there. The Chisholm Trail is his latest one. And actually, tell us the full title of that book, if you would, Jim.
Oh, it's called The Chisholm Trail, Joseph McCoy's Great Gamble.
And what was Joseph McCoy's gamble?
That he could actually make money on the cattle trade. But he was gambling on markets. He was gambling on ecological resources, being there all the time, the grasses that powered the drives from Texas into Kansas. He had to worry about the same thing that and this is one of the things that led me to the Chisholm Trail book, was the similarity in terms of driving cattle north out of Texas to the similarity of applying the Santa Fe Trail in wagons. I mean, you are still relying on the same resources, grass and water. You had to have both.
Right.
And then he had troubles with disease, with the trouble with Texas tick fever, and so he had a lot to overcome in terms of the gamble that he put forward. And he always referred to it as a faro game, F-A-R-O. Faro was a very popular gambling card game at that time. And he referred to the cattle trade as that. And it sort of struck me when I was with my cousin not too long ago, a few years ago. I was at the sale barns with him, and looking at the cattle buying at the time. And cattle prices were really high, and the returns were very low. And I asked my cousin, how in the world could anybody make any money off this? And he said, you can't. And it just struck me that the guys bidding on this, it was just a form of sort of institutionalized gambling, because you're gambling that prices will change, markets will change, and you'll be able to do okay with it. And sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. So yes, the big gamble.
Well, it is 1 o'clock. I think most folks probably have to finish up. We did have one last question if you wanted to stay on. But I think everybody, if you have to go, thank you, everyone. We are going to go ahead and address this question. If you have a second, go ahead, Retta.
Hey, as a kid, I had the Boys Book of Indians. It emphasized the difference between the plains tribes' life before the horse and after. Any of that over 50 years ago now still relevant?
Well, Rather, there's a lot of the research that the earlier anthropologists, archaeologists did is still very relevant today. But some of it also is colored through certain kind of cultural lenses and social lenses. And you have to be aware of that, which means that those of us writing today have to kind of be aware of our own, which we probably aren't. But so there's sort of a romanticization, though, oftentimes that occurs in the writing as well, that that aspect is really not warranted. And in part, what those of us who write about it now, it seems like in light of that previous romanticizing of High Plains Indian life, that somehow we're denigrating those people by bringing in other realities into the story. But what I think we're doing is putting more of a human look to the story, treating them as human beings with their own desires and aspirations, loves and hates that humans have been known to have throughout time. And so to try to put a more human cast on the story, I don't think it denigrates them. It actually makes it more remarkable what they've been able to achieve.